This week I'm going to show you how I made a oak drop leaf desk for my husband on the narrowboat, but it didn't go quite as I planned it to when it came to mounting it, and you'll see why shortly. So yeah, keep on watching if you want to see how to make one. So I had a little spot here right behind where our armchairs currently go, and I wanted it in a way that when it gets put down the chairs can go back as normal and nothing's in the way. I also wanted it to be sturdy, so I checked with the stud finder and made marks where they were. In short, there's meant to be one where the trims are and one in between, but I'll talk about another issue that I had later. And I made marks for reference. I'd also got my husband to pretend sitting to work out a comfortable height for his desktop, and what I planned was 1200mm by 600mm. And I found some oak strips perfect for the job at my dad's woodyard. But they were all different lengths and I needed to cut them down to match. I'll leave some free plans below if it helps, but you'll need to alter them for your stud work. Also note that these strips were already rounded on the ends, but 4 buttered together was just over 600mm, so I left them as they were. Anyway, they weren't quite long enough, which meant I needed to make up to 1200mm by adding strips either end running in the opposite direction. The quickest way to find out what cuts I needed to do was to pull out the tape measure to the length I needed, hold it against the length of a strip and see what was left. Then divide that discrepancy by 2, set the fence up to that on a table saw and rip 2 pieces down. But I'll need the curved edges being on the outside. And this was all done under supervision because this table saw still scares me today. Well, remember, I used to be shorter than this. And after cutting them down slightly bigger than the depth for now, I'll be using a biscuit joiner with size 20 biscuits. Don't worry, all the links to things that I'm using will be below. And while the boards are pushed together and perfectly in line, I drew straight lines across it for references where the boards met, and this gave me matching marks where I needed to cut my biscuit slots. I'll sort those end pieces out later. But it's important to set up the biscuit joiner to the right depth and at the right angle. And I recommend doing some tests on an offcut first. And if this isn't for you or you don't have one, then you could use a dowel jig instead. And it's now time for my favourite part, cutting biscuit slots where my pencil references were while clamped to a workbench. After all 4 strips were done, I pushed all the boards together again and positioned and marked 2 biscuit slots per end of the side trim. But being careful they wouldn't clash, nor being too close to the end because I didn't want the slots to be visible once the whole thing was put together. Now it's time to glue, biscuit and clamp all the main boards. And make sure you're using glue that dries clear. For those wondering, as much as I love the curved edges, they're not practical for a desk, so that section will be facing the wall. And I left it overnight to set. Day 2, the clamps came off and I wanted to absolutely make sure that the ends were completely flat, so I smoothed with a belt sander. Then repeat the gluing, biscuiting and clamping on the shorter side strips, but I knew I'd need to cut the protruding bits off later to match. And of course, because it's even longer, I then had to hunt for even bigger sash clamps. You can never have enough clamps. For day 3, it's another stripy top and all of the glue is set. And this is where I trimmed the sides excess off with a handsaw. And a job that you love to hate, sanding. Next time, I think I'll bring my cabinet scraper. I belt sanded all of the glue off and made sure everything was completely flat. And something that I learned very early on when starting any kind of woodworking was to sand on an angle when going along with the grain to avoid uneven dips. When I got to the end pieces, I'd also follow that technique, but the grain is running in the opposite direction. But before I worked my way up to finer, higher numbered grits, I wanted to soften the edges by matching the existing curve using a palm router. Again, I always recommend doing some tests on offcuts to see if things would match. Really, I would have been better starting on the shorter sides because you need to be careful on the corners if there's any end grain because it can take a chunk off. But as it was set up like this in front of me, I'd stop an inch before the end and carefully run right to left. And I say carefully because it can dangerously bite when you're not going in the same direction as your router. But if you don't have one of these, note wrong with hand sanding. After repeating for all 4 sides, I still had a sharp cross-cut showing on the reverse. But if you remember, this side won't be seen. And I took off the sharp corners with some sandpaper. Okay, back to the top side up. I had some very fine joins that were visible and I wanted to hide them. I blew off any dust with an air blower and ran more wood glue in them and pushed into the cracks with a chisel. And while it's wet, I went over the glued area with a belt sander again, so any dust would blend in. And more fine but boring sanding again. Now I thought long and hard about the finish that I wanted, but I ended up choosing this Ronseal's water-based non-yellowing exterior satin varnish. And the reason was, narrowboats get condensation, but how much we don't know yet because we haven't experienced a full winter on it. But if you'd pick something different, then I'd love to hear your suggestions below and why. And after it was touched dry, roughly about 4 hours, although the tin suggests 6, I'd come back, lightly sand it with 240 grit and repeated until I had 4 coats. Then took it to the boat to fit. Cross my fingers. Now because I'd made it away from the boat, I was worried it was going to be too short in width, leaving no room for error. Anyway, first I transferred the same height for the brackets with a marked offcut. My first hurdle though was that these brackets have a moving mechanism, so I needed to leave about 5mm clearance from the trim. And after measuring a 3-inch gap between the ply lining and the hull, where a hole is for one of our sink wastes, I pre-drilled a screw on an angle to fix to it. So in hindsight, I would definitely fix the brackets first before you even make your top. And I only screwed 1 per bracket initially, just in case. As for the opposite side, it was now just too far away from the batten, and I personally don't think that the plywood alone would have held the weight. I felt I had to fix it to the middle batten instead and positioned the tabletop further to the left, which actually made it central for a computer screen that's going to go on the wall, and there's more space to the side for a future desk for me. And finally, I was expecting to have to wedge washers under the table before hand screwing, as most boat walls are tapered. But I had to eyeball this because spirit levels have no place on a boat. So let's test it, shall we? Might need some WD-40 on that. And when it's not being used as a desk or a table, what I love about it is that it can be hidden away behind our armchairs while only using the space in the gunnels, and it doesn't stick out. So overall, I think it is really cool. I'm still beating myself up over the fact that I could have made it a little bit longer. The only issue or doubts that I had in my mind was I was worried about the desk being too heavy and whether these studs could take the weight, and I started making it before the brackets even turned up. So I didn't know how far away they came away from the wall and whether they'd be shallower than the trim, but actually it's the other way around. But I'm very pleased, and hopefully my husband will be too. Anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed this one, and I'll catch you in my next one. Thanks for watching. Bye. So keep on watching. Anyway, it didn't quite go as planned as... No, don't do this again. I'm testing it. got to go home. A bit longer. The other thing, I've got to stop doing this.